Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You are reading a dispatch about a deeply polarized republic.
Right.
Politicians are basically utilizing organized street gangs to intimidate voters. The wealth gap between the richest citizens and, well, the working class has just grown to these staggering, unprecedented levels.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
Right. And meanwhile, there's this highly ambitious populist leader with massive wealth, and he's promising to bypass the traditional corrupt political establishment and, restore the nation to its former glory.
Which really sounds like a modern editorial.
Exactly. But you are actually reading an account of the Roman Republic in the mid-1st century BCE.
Yeah.
And the details align so perfectly that it sends this distinct chill of recognition down your spine, that sensation where you feel like you are reading today's news just with different costumes and older technology. It's a really persistent human experience.
It really is.
It is the feeling of historical déjà vu.
Yeah.
And you are not alone in feeling it. So today we are taking a deep dive into the concept of historical recurrence.
Right, a massive topic.
Yeah, by synthesizing a broad array of sources from the chronicles of ancient Greek historians to the biological metaphors of early 20th century philosophers and down to modern mathematical demographic models, our mission is to understand how and why civilizations rise, fall, and potentially repeat themselves.
Which brings us to the core question.
Right. Are we trapped in an endless historical loop, or do we actually have the agency to steer the ship?
Well, that question requires us to fundamentally examine how humanity even perceives time,
Yeah.
To understand the modern models of repeating history, we really have to look backward at how the ancients conceptualized governance and the universe.
I kind of have to start there.
Exactly. We can't analyze modern cyclical theories without thoroughly examining their roots in Greco-Roman thought. And a substantial source for this is G.W. Trump's 1979 work, The Idea of Historical Recurrence in Western Thought.
Okay, so what does Trump lay out?
So he details how ancient thinkers categorize the rhythms of human events. Ancient Western thinkers initially focused on cosmological recurrence.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning the concept that the physical universe itself resets and repeats over vast expanses of time. It's a macro-level view.
Got it.
But eventually, that macro-level cosmological view trickled down into micro-level political theory.
So let's focus on that political theory, because I think that's where it gets really applicable for us. We need to look at the Greek historian Polybius, right?
Yes, Polybius. He was writing in the 2nd century BCE.
And he formalized this concept known as anacyclosis.
Right, anacyclosis.
Which is basically a theory of political evolution and, well, ultimately political decay. He argued that the structures of governments do not change randomly based on the whims of individuals, right?
Exactly. It's not random.
Rather, they naturally cycle through 6 specific mechanical stages. But how exactly does he map out this cycle? Like, why does a society move from one stage to the next?
Well, Polybius observed that human societies in their most primitive state naturally form around a single strong leader for protection.
Like a tribe looking for a chieftain.
Right. And this is the genesis of monarchy. In its initial phase, the monarch rules through virtue and a genuine desire to protect the people.
They earn their spot.
Exactly. But over time, and usually this is just a matter of a few generations, the monarch's descendants inherit this absolute power without ever having to earn it.
So they lack the virtue of the founder.
Yeah, they become accustomed to luxury and being totally unaccountable. So the monarchy devolves into tyranny. The ruler basically stops serving the people and starts exploiting them.
And that exploitation inevitably creates a breaking point, right?
Yes, the tyranny becomes unbearable. So, in response to the tyrant's abuses, the most noble, capable, and courageous citizens, who are often the military leaders or prominent landowners, they rise up.
They overthrow the tyrant.
Right, and they establish an aristocracy. And the word aristocracy literally means rule by the best.
So for a time, this works out.
It does. The aristocrats govern with a sense of civic duty. But following the exact same generational decay that corrupted the monarchy, the descendants of these noble founders inherit their status.
They didn't have to fight the tyrants, so they forget the sacrifices of their ancestors.
Precisely. They begin to use the state apparatus to enrich themselves exclusively. So the aristocracy decays into an oligarchy, which is simply ruled by the wealthy few, completely detached from the needs of the wider population.
So the oligarchs hoard the wealth, and naturally the masses do not tolerate that indefinitely. I mean, they are being squeezed economically and shut out politically.
Yeah, I've had enough.
So the masses revolt. Just like the aristocrats did before them, they overthrow the oligarchs and establish a democracy demanding equality and a voice in their own governance.
Right.
But Polybius argues that this democracy also has a fatal flaw, right? It doesn't just last forever.
No, he argues that democracy inevitably rots from within, and it's due to human psychology. In the early days of a democracy, citizens value equality and freedom of speech above all else. But as generations pass, people become accustomed to these freedoms. They begin to take them for granted. The society becomes wealthy, and citizens begin to demand more personal entitlements.
I mean, politicians want to win elections, so they pander to that.
Exactly. Politicians, eager to gain power, start pandering to these desires. Demagogues emerge. They promise the masses wealth and property taken from others in exchange for votes.
Wow.
Yeah. The rule of law breaks down as the population essentially votes to enrich themselves at the expense of the state's stability. So democracy devolves into mob rule, or what is sometimes called ochlocracy.
And what happens when you have mob rule? Just complete social chaos, right?
Complete chaos.
The streets are unsafe, the economy is paralyzed, and there's just no coherent leadership. So the society becomes so desperate for stability that they willingly surrender their democratic rights to a strongman.
Right. Someone who promises to restore order by any means necessary.
And that strongman becomes the new monarch. The cycle of anacyclosis resets, and the whole wheel starts turning all over again.
Exactly. The structural mechanics are very rigid here. Polybius viewed statecraft almost like a machine. And this perspective pairs seamlessly with the insights of another Greek historian, Thucydides, who wrote his history of the Peloponnesian War a few centuries earlier.
Okay, so how does Thucydides fit into this machine?
Well, if Polybius gives us the mechanical cycle of the state, Thucydides identifies the psychological engine that turns the gears.
The why behind it all.
Right. Thucydides wrote that his historical accounts would be useful to future generations precisely because events of the same sort are bound to happen again.
Because he believed human nature is uniform.
That is the core of his philosophy. Human nature does not evolve or change. As long as humans are humans, they will be driven by three primary motives: fear, honor, and self-interest.
Fear, honor, and self-interest.
Yes, and because these psychological drivers remain constant across the centuries, the political outcomes they produce will inevitably recur.
Okay, so that leads to a really common historical division people often cite. There is this assumption that the Greco-Roman world viewed time as a circle, this endless cycle of anacyclosis,
Right.
while the Judeo-Christian world, which eventually dominated Western thought, viewed time as a straight line.
That's a standard narrative, yeah.
The idea is that Judeo-Christian time moves clearly from a definitive point of creation toward a final definitive end of days. It is just a linear march of progress or salvation. But according to Tromp's analysis in the sources, that strict division is a misconception.
Yeah, it is a significant oversimplification of how early Western thinkers actually process time. Trump provides substantial evidence to challenge this binary.
So it wasn't just circle versus line.
No, not at all. While it is true that Judeo-Christian thought has a defined beginning and end, early Christian and Jewish writings contain very strong themes of historical reenactment. They were deeply concerned with patterns.
Do we have an example of that?
Sure. For example, in the biblical texts of Luke and Acts, you see distinct, deliberate patterns where present actions are understood as direct imitations or fulfillments of sacred archetypes from the past.
So it is not just a straight line. It is a line that frequently loops back on itself conceptually.
Exactly. Consider the concept of retribution, which is heavily featured in these texts. The idea that specific moral failings will predictably and recurrently evoke an appropriate disastrous consequence that is fundamentally cyclical in its mechanics.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if a society turns away from its moral foundation, it falls. If it repents, it rises. That is a cycle of behavior and consequence.
Right.
So you have the synthesis developing in Western thought. It blends the Greek cyclical mechanics of government with the Judeo-Christian concept of historical meaning and divine retribution.
And when did that synthesis really take hold?
It peaked much later during the Renaissance, where thinkers actually tried to map out the exact lifespans of republics based on these ancient models.
Okay, but I have to ask, though, are we just projecting these patterns onto the past?
What do you mean?
Well, if human beings are prone to greed, we will see greed in every era. If we look hard enough for a strong man replacing a mob, we can probably find one in any century.
That's a fair point.
Are we actually observing a mechanical structure of society resetting? Or is this simply a psychological fallacy on our part? We like patterns,
Yeah.
so we force history into a neat circle.
Well, the tension between perception and reality defines the entire field of historical study. Are the cycles a physical reality of human organization, or are they just a comforting framework we lay over the absolute chaos of human events to make them feel manageable?
Because if history is just random, chaotic noise, that is terrifying.
Exactly. Cycles give us a sense of predictability. And to explore how deeply this desire for predictability goes, we really need to look at how these theories evolved over time.
Right.
The ancient models were based on political philosophy, but in the early 20th century, the approach shifted dramatically.
Yeah, the trauma of global conflict really shattered the prevailing linear narrative. Because throughout the 19th century, the dominant Western model was heavily Eurocentric and linear.
Very much so.
The assumption was that humanity, led by European civilization, was marching steadily upward toward peak modernity and just endless progress. But then World War I happened.
Right, and the devastation of the First World War made the idea of endless, rational human progress seem completely absurd. Which brings us to a specific moment in time.
Let's set the scene.
The setting is Germany in 1918. The country is exhausted, it's blockaded, and it's on the verge of total defeat. The intellectual establishment is just in ruins,
It's a bleak picture.
incredibly bleak. And in the midst of this despair, an unknown gymnasium teacher named Oswald Spengler publishes a massive work called The Decline of the West.
And he wasn't exactly sitting in a plush academic office, right?
Yeah, not at all. Spengler is living in poor health in a dark Munich apartment, and he's so destitute he can barely afford food, let alone the books he needs for his research. Yet, against all odds, his book rapidly becomes a defining text of the era.
Yeah, and he proposed what he called a Copernican overturning of history. He completely discarded the timeline
He
approach.
threw it out.
He argued that human cultures do not operate as data points on a straight line of progress. Instead, he replaced the linear model with a biological model. Spengler argued that cultures operate as living organisms.
Right, like a plant.
Exactly like a plant or an animal, they have a natural, unalterable, predictable rhythm. They are born, they grow, they mature, and they die. He broke this down into seasons: a spring, a summer, an autumn, and a winter.
And we really need to examine what those seasons represent in his framework, because it completely reframes how we view societal achievements.
Okay, let's go through.
So the spring of a culture is its birth. It is an era characterized by myth, deep religious feeling, intuition, and the emergence of a powerful, unified cultural soul.
So it's very spiritual and connected.
Yes, the people are deeply connected to the land. Think of the Homeric aristocracy in early Greece, or the early Middle Ages in Europe with its deep, intuitive faith and those soaring Gothic cathedrals.
And then the culture matures into summer.
Right. Summer is a period of growth and testing. The intuitive religion of spring starts to be analyzed and codified. It is characterized by the rise of robust city-states, early philosophical exploration, and strict societal forms.
Making sense of the spring, basically.
Exactly. And following that is autumn. Autumn represents maturity. This is the peak of intellectual and artistic achievement. The cities grow larger, the philosophy becomes highly systematic, and the arts reach their most refined state.
The golden age.
But autumn is also the beginning of exhaustion. The pure, vital energy of the spring has been entirely spent in producing these great works.
And then comes winter.
Winter.
This is where Spengler makes a critical distinction that is really vital to understanding his entire worldview. He draws a hard, definitive line between culture and civilization.
Yes, capital C for both.
Right. In everyday language, we use those words interchangeably. But for Spengler, they are opposites. When a society is in its spring, summer, and autumn, it is a culture.
Right.
It is creative, dynamic, and full of inward-looking vitality. It is actually inventing new things. But winter represents the shift into civilization. And for Spengler, civilization is essentially a terminal disease.
And that distinction is really the bedrock of his pessimism. Civilization represents a society's expansive, arrogant, but ultimately sterile and dying phase.
The creativity is gone.
The creative blooming is totally over. A civilization no longer invents, It merely organizes and expands what the culture already created. It focuses on imperialism, on building massive, soulless world cities, on rigid administrative bureaucracy, and the relentless accumulation of wealth.
So the focus shifts from the philosopher and the artist to, like, the engineer and the financier.
Precisely. It is outward physical expansion masking total internal decay. The Romans, for example, were the civilization phase of the classical world.
Okay, how so?
Well, the Greeks, in their spring and autumn, created the philosophy, the art, and the mathematics. The Romans just built the roads and the massive administrative bureaucracy to police it all. They were engineers, not creators.
If I can offer a visual analogy here,
Go for it.
think of Spengler's civilization phase,
Hmm.
like a massive flowering plant that has gone to seed. During the spring and summer, it produced vibrant, unique flowers. But in winter, those flowers are dead. The
Right.
plant dries out, and it releases thousands of seeds into the wind. The plant might cover far more physical ground than ever before, like it might spread across the entire yard, but its actual creative blooming phase is permanently over.
It's just a husk.
Exactly. It is just spreading the sterile remnants of what it once was.
And that analogy perfectly aligns with Spengler's view of the West in 1918. He believed Western Europe had entered its winter phase, and he applied this biological life cycle to different historical groupings, identifying specific cultural archetypes to prove his point.
What's our archetype in his view?
The archetype we inhabit, he argued, is the Faustian culture. This encompasses Western Europe and its extensions.
Faustian, like the guy who sold his soul.
Right. The Faustian soul is characterized by an insatiable yearning for infinity, limitless knowledge, and the conquering of absolute distance. It is embodied by the myth of Faust, the scholar who makes a pact with the devil for infinite understanding.
How does that show up historically?
You see this Faustian drive in the invention of calculus, the creation of perspective in painting that stretches to an infinite vanishing point, and eventually the drive for space exploration.
And he contrasts this deeply with the Apollonian culture of the classical Greek and Roman world, right?
Very deeply. The Apollonian soul is the complete opposite of the Faustian. It lives purely in the present moment. The Apollonian worldview is indifferent to the distant past or the infinite future.
They weren't looking outward in the same way.
Exactly. Spengler noted that the pure Greek man had no real sense of history, cared nothing for the distant morrow, and built his life entirely around the tangible, physical present. The symbol for the Apollonian culture is the self-contained, freestanding Doric column. It is a physical body in the present, with no desire to reach into the infinite.
Spengler also identifies a third major archetype, the Magian culture.
Yes.
This encompasses the Arabian, Jewish, and early Byzantine worlds, roughly peaking around the time of the early Middle Ages. The primary symbol for the Magian culture is the cavern.
The cavern, right.
It is a worldview defined by a strict dualism, light versus dark, good versus evil, and a sense of enclosed, divinely ordained space. It is expressed architecturally in structures like the Pantheon in Rome or the domed mosque, where the interior space feels like a self-contained universe.
And the crucial takeaway from Spengler here is his belief that these cultures are so profoundly distinct in their underlying souls that they cannot truly understand one another.
They are completely walled off.
Essentially, yes. And more importantly, the life cycle is completely deterministic. When a culture hits its winter phase, when it transitions from culture to civilization, it is doomed.
There's no stopping it.
No. He viewed the early 20th century as the West transitioning into a sterile period of world states fighting brutal wars for economic supremacy, with genuine creativity dead and gone forever.
It is an incredibly fatalistic view.
Yep.
I mean, Spengler's basically saying the DNA of our culture dictates its inevitable death, and no amount of good policy, leadership, or human effort can stop winter from arriving.
It's very bleak.
If you're born in the winter, your only job is just to manage the decline. But this fatalism is exactly what our next framework reacts against.
Yeah.
If Spengler's biological doom feels too passive, did anyone look at this same massive timeline and find a way out?
Yes, they did.
This brings us to the British historian Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee looked at the exact same rise and fall of civilizations, but found a completely different mechanism, one driven not by biological fate, but by human choice and action.
Arnold Toynbee is just a monumental figure in historiography. Between 1934 and 1961, he published a staggering 12-volume work titled A Study of History.
12 volumes, that's massive.
It is. He examined the life cycles of dozens of separate civilizations.
Yeah.
But he firmly rejected Spengler's biological determinism. Toynbee did not believe civilizations were plants growing and dying on a set, unalterable schedule.
So what was his theory?
Instead, he identified a mechanism he called the challenge and response theory.
Let's break down this challenge and response concept. Toynbee argued that civilizations are not born in lush, easy environments.
Right, they don't start in paradise.
If the environment is too perfect, food is everywhere and the climate is mild, a society remains static. It stays primitive because it has absolutely no incentive to change or adapt. Civilizations are actually born from extreme adversity. They emerge when a society is forced to overcome a severe challenge.
And the nature of that challenge can vary. It could be a harsh climate shift, difficult geography, or extreme external military pressures from neighboring groups.
Do we have an example from his work?
Yes, for example, Toynbee argued that ancient Egyptian civilization was formed when the grasslands of North Africa began to dry up. The population was forced to migrate to the inhospitable swamps of the Nile Valley.
Which was a massive challenge.
Huge! The massive challenge of draining those swamps and managing the annual floodwaters required complex social organization. So the challenge stimulated the creation of the civilization.
But the challenge has to be calibrated perfectly, right?
What do you mean?
Well, if the challenge is too weak, there is no stimulus to innovate. But if the challenge is overwhelmingly severe, like a sudden ice age or an unstoppable invasion, the society is simply crushed.
Ah, yes, the Goldilocks zone for adversity.
Exactly. But if the challenge is just right, a society responds by innovating. And the vital component in this response, according to Toynbee, is a specific group of people he terms the creative minority.
The creative minority is the small segment of the population that actually figures out how to solve the society's existential problem. They are the innovators, the philosophers, the military strategists, the leaders.
So it's not everyone pitching in equally to invent the solution.
No, the masses, the majority of the population, do not invent the solutions, but because the creative minority successfully navigates the crisis and secures the society's survival, they inspire the rest of the masses to follow them voluntarily.
They lead by example.
Exactly. The process is based on inspiration and imitation. The civilization continues to grow as long as it successfully responds to successive challenges through the continuous dynamic leadership of this creative minority.
But civilizations do fall. I mean, that's a historical fact. So how does Toynbee explain the decline without using Spengler's biological clock?
The mechanism of decline in Toynbee's model is deeply psychological and sociological. A civilization collapses when the creative minority loses its innovative spark. They stop solving new challenges.
They get complacent.
Yeah, perhaps they become too comfortable, or they rely on old solutions for new problems. However, even though they are no longer innovating, they desperately want to retain their power, their wealth, and their privileged status in society.
Right, they don't want to give up their spot.
So, consequently, the creative minority undergoes a transformation. They devolve into a dominant elite.
They stop leading by inspiration and start ruling by force and coercion.
That is the turning point. Once they become an oppressive, dominant elite, the internal proletariat, which is the masses who used to follow them voluntarily, they become profoundly alienated.
The trust is broken.
Completely. The society loses its internal cohesion. It splinters. Because the society is no longer united, it starts responding effectively to new external or internal challenges. This leads to internal decay and eventually social disintegration.
So it's an internal failure, not an external clock.
Exactly. The critical difference between Toynbee and Spengler is Toynbee's focus on human agency or free will. A civilization fails because of human failure, specifically a failure of creativity and leadership, not because of a predetermined cosmic winter.
That is a much more empowering view. It implies that if we are smart enough and our leaders are creative enough, we can keep the civilization growing indefinitely. We are not doomed by our DNA.
It gives us a choice.
But we do have to look critically at Toynbee's grand framework. The sources highlight a significant critique by the Dutch historian Peter Gale.
Gale was very critical, yes.
Gale pointed out that Toynbee's model might be far too broad to be analytically useful. When you zoom out to look at the entire lifespan of the Roman Empire or the Mayan civilization over thousands of years, challenge and response sounds highly plausible. It makes for a great story.
It's very narrative friendly.
But Gale argued it lacks empirical rigor. It does not explain the highly specific, localized economic and political factors that cause a specific society to collapse at a specific moment in time.
And Gale's critique really strikes at the heart of macro history. When you deal in vast civilizational timescales spanning thousands of years, it is remarkably easy to cherry-pick historical data to fit a preconceived narrative.
You can just find whatever you're looking for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can always find a challenge and a response if you look hard enough. This brings us to a crucial shift in recurrence theory. Toynbee and Spengler were looking at massive civilizations over millennia. But in the late 20th century, two authors, William Strauss and Neil Howe, decided to alter the scale completely.
They zoomed in.
They zoomed way in. They hypothesized that the rhythm of history is not found in the rise and fall of thousand-year empires, but within the biological scale of a single human lifespan.
This is the Strauss-Howe generational theory, which has gained significant traction in contemporary discussions. Their core concept is built around a unit of time called the saeculum.
A saeculum.
Right. A saeculum is a concept dating back to the Etruscans and Romans, measuring roughly 80 to 100 years. It represents the length of a long human life, or the time it takes for all living memory of a specific major historical event to pass away.
And within this 80 to 100-year saeculum, Strauss and Howe identify 4 distinct eras, which they call turnings. Each turning lasts roughly 20 years.
Which maps onto a generation.
Right. It roughly correlates to the phases of human development: childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and old age. The theory posits that the cycle always follows the exact same sequence: the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis.
And the mood of the society shifts dramatically as it moves from one turning to the next.
It does.
Let's walk through these turnings, using the United States as the primary example from the text. The first turning is the high. A high occurs immediately after a major existential crisis has been resolved.
Right, the crisis is over.
During a high, societal institutions are exceptionally strong and trusted. Individualism is weak, and society is highly cohesive, conformist, and confident about the future. People want to build and stabilize.
So what's the U.S. example?
In the U.S., Strauss and Howe point to the post-World War II period, from 1946 to the early 1960s, as the most recent high.
But that heavy conformity eventually creates friction. Young people growing up during the high feel spiritually and culturally stifled by the rigid institutions.
They rebel.
Right. This generational friction leads to the second turning, the awakening. This is a period of intense spiritual and cultural upheaval. The strong institutions built during the high are attacked in the name of personal autonomy, deeper meaning, and self-awareness.
And for the U.S., this will be.
The consciousness revolution of the 1960s and 70s in the U.S. is identified as the most recent awakening. The focus shifts from building external infrastructure to exploring internal values.
And following the exhaustion of that awakening comes the third turning, the unraveling.
The unravel.
The mood during an unraveling is the exact opposite of a high. The institutions that were attacked during the awakening are now deeply distrusted, weakened, and decaying. Meanwhile, individualism is paramount and flourishing.
Everyone is in their own camp.
Yeah, society fragments into different ideological camps. Civic debate becomes hostile and polarized. Strauss and Howe place the U.S. unraveling as beginning in the 1980s and stretching through the intense culture wars of the 90s and early 2000s.
Which inevitably sets the stage for the fourth turning, the crisis.
Here we go.
This is an era of institutional destruction and rebuilding. It usually involves severe conflict, total war, or catastrophic economic collapse. The society perceives an existential threat to its survival.
So they have to band together again.
Exactly. The intense individualism of the unraveling is abandoned because it is no longer useful for survival. The society is forced to coalesce again, completely tearing down the old social order and replacing it with a new one.
The previous crisis in the U.S. was the combination of the Great Depression and World War II. According to their model, the current era we are navigating, the millennial era, represents a fourth turning crisis.
And what drives this entire cycle is not just abstract societal mood, but the actual people living through it.
The generations themselves.
Right. Strauss and Howe argue that these turnings are propelled by 4 distinct generational archetypes that repeat in sequence: the prophet, the nomad, the hero, and the artist.
The interaction between these generational archetypes and the turnings is really the actual engine of the theory.
Yeah, how they overlap.
The generation you are born into dictates how you will respond to the specific era you come of age in. For example, a prophet generation is born during a high. Because society is stable and prosperous, they grow up indulged and heavily protected by their parents.
So how do they act as adults?
They come of age during an awakening as idealistic, moralistic crusaders who attack the institutions. The baby boomers are identified as a prophet generation.
Okay, then you have the nomad generation. They are born during the awakening. Because society is focused on spiritual upheaval and adult self-discovery, these children grow up underprotected.
Left to their own devices?
Essentially, yes. They come of age in a time of social chaos and institutional decay. Consequently, they become pragmatic, resilient, cynical, and somewhat alienated adults. Generation X is classified as a nomad generation?
Following the nomads is the hero generation. They're born during the unraveling. As society senses impending trouble and fragmentation, parents become increasingly protective of their children again.
Helicopter parents start showing up.
Right. They come of age as pragmatic, team-oriented, confident young adults. Historically, they are the generation tasked with physically fighting and resolving the fourth turning crisis. The GI generation of World War II is the classic hero archetype, and Strauss and Howe classify the millennial generation as the current hero archetype.
Finally, the artist generation is born during the crisis itself. They are overprotected by parents who are actively traumatized by the ongoing chaos and war.
Because the world is literally falling apart around them.
Right. Because they grow up in a terrifying world, they become sensitive, conformist, process-oriented adults. They do not want to rock the boat. Their role is to help stabilize and administer the new society during the subsequent high. The silent generation fits this role in the mid-20th century.
Now, at this juncture, we must state explicitly that we are examining this theory analytically based on the provided source material.
Right, just looking at the texts.
The sources note that the Strauss-Howe theory, particularly the concept of the impending fourth turning crisis, was notably adopted by Steve Bannon and heavily influenced the political strategy of the Trump administration. Bannon even directed a documentary film based on the theory called Generation Zero.
And we're reporting strictly on how this historical framework has migrated from academic theory into applied modern political strategy. We are not endorsing or condemning the theory, the administration, or the political figures involved.
Right. It is simply a matter of historical record that this cyclical framework has influenced contemporary policy and political messaging.
Exactly.
So, with that context established, we have to address the academic pushback to this theory because it is substantial. A major criticism is that Strauss-Howe theory acts as a sort of historical horoscope.
A historical horoscope, yeah.
Is it not dangerously deterministic to lump everyone born in a 20-year span into a single behavioral archetype, regardless of their race, their economic class, or where they live geographically?
That's a huge generalization.
Right. A wealthy teenager attending a private academy in New York and a struggling teenager in rural Appalachia might both technically be millennials, but their historical experiences, opportunities, and psychological outlooks are wildly different. How can they share a single generational soul?
And that criticism regarding determinism is the most frequent academic response to Strauss and Howe. Critics argue their theory is largely unfalsifiable.
You can't prove it wrong because it's too vague.
Exactly. It relies too heavily on highly subjective interpretations of a social mood. More importantly, it largely ignores the profound, tangible impact of class, race, and geographic location on how individuals actually experience historical events.
Which are huge factors.
Massive factors. If a theory is so elastic that it can bend to explain almost any cultural event after the fact, its actual predictive power is highly questionable. It risks becoming an exercise in confirmation bias, where we only notice the cultural artifacts that fit the turning we believe we are in.
So, if generational theory relies too heavily on subjective mood and these poetic, horoscope-like archetypes, where do we look for a more concrete answer?
Will you look at the numbers?
Right. Our next framework attempts to strip away the philosophy, the poetry, and the subjective mood entirely. It relies instead on cold, hard data and mathematical modeling to predict the rise and fall of societies. It asks the question, what if historical cycles are driven by physics and math rather than generational psychology?
This represents a vital evolution in recurrence thinking. We are discussing structural demographic theory, often abbreviated as SDT.
SDT.
This framework was pioneered by the sociologist Jack Goldstone in the 1980s and subsequently expanded heavily by quantitative historians like Peter Turchin and Sergei Nefedov.
So what are they looking at?
They do not look at vague concepts like cultural souls. They look at what they call secular cycles in complex agrarian and industrialized systems. They rely on empirical, measurable data, population numbers, grain prices, real wages, and the financial health of the state treasury.
SDT divides a historical society into three distinct measurable components: the state apparatus, the elites, and the general population.
The three main pillars.
And the theory tracks how these three components interact through specific mathematical feedback loops. The cycle begins with what they term the integrative phase, which is essentially an expansion phase. How does the math work during this initial phase?
During the integrative phase, the overall population is relatively low compared to the abundant resources available. Because there is plenty of land and food, the population grows comfortably.
Makes sense.
Real wages for the working class are high because labor is relatively scarce, food is affordable, and the society is generally highly stable. The state treasury collects ample taxes without having to oppress the population.
Sounds like a good time to be alive.
It is, but this mathematical growth cannot last indefinitely. Eventually, the population hits the carrying capacity of the land or the underlying economy.
And when you hit that ceiling, when the population outgrows the resources, the society shifts into stagflation. This marks the beginning of the disintegrative phase.
And the math gets very grim very quickly.
Economic stress builds. Living standards for the common population drop sharply as wages stagnate and food prices soar. Famines become more frequent and severe, and peasant rebellions start brewing. But the most dangerous mechanical lever in this theory, the thing that actually brings the state down, is a concept called elite overproduction.
Yes, elite overproduction is the critical destabilizing variable for state breakdown in SDT.
Okay, unpack that for us.
During the prosperous decades of the integrative phase, the elite class also experiences massive growth. Elite families have more children who survive to adulthood. Furthermore, upward economic mobility brings new, wealthy individuals into the elite strata.
More people at the top.
But here is the structural problem. Power and prestige are fundamentally finite resources. In any given society, there are only so many generalships, high political offices, or vast aristocratic estates to go around.
I want to focus on this because it flips how we usually think about societal collapse. We usually think societies collapse because people get too poor. But SDT argues societies collapse because they produce too many wealthy, ambitious people.
It's counterintuitive, but it's mathematically sound.
To use an analogy, elite overproduction is like a high-stakes game of musical chairs.
Right.
During the expansion phase, there are plenty of chairs. Everyone in the elite class has a seat of power. But as the population booms and the economy stagnates, you suddenly have a massive surplus of elites, too many highly educated, wealthy players fighting for a finite number of chairs. And when ambitious, highly resourced people realize they're going to lose their elite status and be pushed down the social ladder, they do not just accept it gracefully.
They absolutely do not.
They do not walk away from the game. Someone is eventually going to flip the table.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanics of state breakdown. The surplus elites become desperate. When the elites begin warring with each other for those limited positions of power, they form competing factions.
And they need armies.
Exactly. To win this factional war, they mobilize the impoverished, frustrated masses as their foot soldiers. This intense elite competition triggers the crisis phase of the disintegrative cycle.
The state just tears itself apart.
The central state collapses under the weight of this factional conflict. Warfare becomes endemic, and the society suffers what is known as a Malthusian catastrophe.
Explain the Malthusian catastrophe in this context.
A Malthusian catastrophe is a severe, involuntary demographic collapse driven by famine, disease, and extreme violence. It is nature's brutal reset button. The prolonged civil war destroys infrastructure, which leads to mass starvation, which weakens the population, making them susceptible to plagues.
It is a devastating reset mechanism. The overall population is severely reduced by this catastrophe, but tragically, that massive die-off frees up resources again.
Back to square one?
Yeah, with fewer people, wages go back up, food becomes plentiful, and per capita consumption for the survivors increases.
Yeah.
The elite class has been culled, so there's no longer a surplus. And a new socio-demographic cycle begins.
And what is highly notable about SDT is that researchers like Turchin and Nefedov have applied these mathematical models retrospectively.
Looking at the data.
Yes, they have analyzed centuries of data from medieval and early modern England, France, and Russia, as well as the Roman Republic. They found that the historical data remarkably tracks with these secular cycles.
So it replaces the philosophical poetry of Spengler's Seasons and the subjective archetypes of Strauss-Howe with the grim calculus of carrying capacity and wealth distribution.
Exactly.
The cycles are driven by measurable inputs and outputs. But before we conclude our analysis of these recurring patterns, we must pause and ask a fundamental, overarching question. Is our entire search for historical patterns fundamentally flawed? Is recurrence a rule of human history? Or is it a rule of physics, or is it entirely an illusion created by our own minds?
Well, the sources do touch upon the hard science of recurrence, moving away from human behavior entirely.
Into actual physics.
Right. In the study of dynamical systems, there is Poincaré's recurrence theorem. In simple terms, it states that certain systems will, after a very long but finite time, return to a state very close to their initial configuration.
Just mathematically.
Yes. There is even a quantum recurrence theorem proved in 1975 and Birkhoff's recurrence theorem from 1972, which mathematically map out how continuous maps in compact spaces return to initial points.
To visualize the physics of continuous maps in a compact space without getting lost in the math, imagine a sealed glass jar filled with clear water. You drop a single bead of red dye into the water and start stirring.
Okay, I can picture that.
The dye spreads out, turning the water pink, and eventually the system looks entirely chaotic and mixed. But the physics theorem suggests that if the jar is perfectly sealed, a compact space, and you keep stirring it infinitely, eventually the particles of dye will mathematically align and momentarily form that single, coherent red drop again.
That is wild.
Right. The physical laws of the universe seem to allow for, or even demand, looping structures in closed systems.
But applying the physics of a sealed jar of water to the messy, unpredictable reality of human decision-making brings us to a severe warning outlined in one of our sources.
What's the warning?
This is an essay from the Drew Acorn. It argues that there is an inherent fallacy in perceiving historical recurrence, a profound danger in wanting the cycle to be real.
The fallacy of perception.
The essay warns that while identifying historical similarities can be an interesting intellectual exercise, it becomes incredibly problematic when we use those similarities to define, contextualize, and ultimately predict history.
Because history isn't just a repeating script.
History is, at its core, a record of complex, unique facts. When we become too attached to the idea of a cycle, whether it is a fourth turning or an anacyclosis, we start unconsciously distorting or ignoring the facts to fit our preferred theme.
If we assume we have seen this before, we inevitably discount the massive complexity and unique realities of the present moment. We stop seeing the specific details of a current crisis because we are too busy trying to map it onto the fall of the Roman Republic or the crisis of the 1930s.
We force the puzzle piece to fit.
The essay makes a powerful point. Interpretation should never take precedence over fact. Seeing history purely as a repeating cycle can severely limit our understanding. It can completely blind us to the unprecedented nature of our own time.
It is the ultimate trap of historical education. You become so well-versed in the patterns of the past that you start seeing ghosts everywhere. You miss the actual people and the novel technologies standing right in front of you.
You're fighting the last war, basically.
A modern crisis driven by artificial intelligence and globalized supply chains cannot be perfectly mapped onto the agrarian crises of medieval France, no matter how desperately we want the mathematical models to align.
Let's pull all of this together, because we have covered immense ground today.
We really have.
We started in antiquity, watching Polybius map out the revolving door of political constitutions, from monarchy to mob rule, and saw how early Judeo-Christian thought blended linear destiny with historical reenactment.
Right.
We walked through the ashes of 1918 with Oswald Spengler, viewing cultures as biological organisms doomed to a sterile, uncreative winter. We countered that pessimism with Arnold Toynbee, who argued that civilizations only fall when our creative minorities stop responding to environmental and social challenges.
And then we zoomed in.
We zoomed into the human lifespan with Strauss and Howe, looking at the 80-year saeculum and the four turnings driven by generational archetypes. And finally, we stripped away the philosophy to look at the cold math of structural demographic theory, where population limits and elite overproduction act as a hydraulic press on society, before finally questioning if our own perception is tricking us into seeing cycles where there are only complex, unprecedented facts.
The breadth of human effort to understand our place in time is staggering. The persistence of these theories across thousands of years proves one thing. Humanity constantly oscillates between feeling like empowered agents of our own destiny and feeling like helpless cogs in a massive, unyielding historical machine.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought to ponder. If we as a species become fully aware of these historical cycles, if we can mathematically model the demographic pressures and elite overproduction that cause state breakdown, or if we can recognize the psychological signs of a fourth turning, does that very awareness grant us the power to break the cycle? Can we use the math to build a better system? Or does our knowledge of the cycle simply become another predetermined variable already factored into the next turning of the wheel?
Something to think about.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.